Join me as I venture into a cursed abandoned village to uncover the scariest horror stories lurking in its shadows. There's something undeniably fascinating about places that have been left to decay, where nature has reclaimed its territory, and humans have abandoned all hope. The stories that surround these places, passed down through generations, are often shrouded in mystery and fear. And today, I want to take you on a journey to a place that has become notorious for its horror stories, an abandoned village that's said to be cursed. The village has been the subject of eerie legends for years, with visitors reporting sightings of ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena that will send chills down your spine. Many have attempted to explore this forsaken place, but few have returned to tell the tale. The brave ones who did venture in have spoken of an unsettling feeling, as if they're being watched by unseen eyes. Others have heard disembodied voices, whispers that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. Some claim to have seen the ghost of a woman in white, wandering the deserted streets, searching for something or someone. Others have reported strange noises, like the sound of children laughing and playing, even though there's no one in sight. The villagers who lived here, before they fled in terror, have spoken of an ancient curse that was placed upon the land, a curse that brings madness and despair to anyone who dares to enter. The list of unexplained occurrences is endless, and it's no wonder that this village has become a hotbed of paranormal activity. But what's most fascinating is that these stories aren't just mere rumors, they're based on real events, witnessed by people who were brave enough to venture into the heart of terror. As I delve deeper into the stories surrounding this village, I've come across first-hand accounts of people who dared to explore it. One explorer told me about the time he stumbled upon an old, abandoned church, where he found strange symbols etched into the walls. Another spoke about the feeling of being pulled towards an old, dilapidated house, as if some unseen force was calling him towards it. And then there was the group of friends who swore they saw a dark figure lurking in the shadows, watching them with cold, dead eyes. One of the most haunting stories I've come across is that of a young couple who decided to spend the night in the village. They set up camp in an old, abandoned house, but soon realized that they weren't alone. They heard footsteps creaking up and down the stairs, and doors slamming shut on their own. But what's most terrifying is that they captured evidence of their ordeal on camera, evidence that will make your blood run cold. But the most terrifying story of all is that of a group of friends who decided to explore the village's ancient ruins. As they made their way deeper into the heart of the ruins, they stumbled upon an ancient artifact that seemed to radiate an otherworldly energy. And then, one by one, they began to vanish, never to be seen again. The last one standing was found days later, driven mad by what he had witnessed. To this day, he remains in a psychiatric hospital, unable to speak about the horrors he experienced. The stories that surround this cursed abandoned village are a stark reminder that some places are better left unexplored. They hold secrets that are too dark, too terrifying, and too otherworldly for us to comprehend. And sometimes, it's better to leave the past in the past, rather than meddling with forces we don't understand. So, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You survived the scariest horror stories from the cursed abandoned village. But if you're feeling brave, I encourage you to share your own horror stories in the comments below. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more scary story videos that will keep you up all night. Part 1. The Descent into the Village. There's something irresistibly alluring about places long abandoned, where only ghosts and secrets linger. In the heart of nowhere, down roads that barely seem traveled, lies a forsaken village, where even the trees seem to whisper stories of regret. I'd heard the legends since I was young, stories of apparitions, unexplained sounds, and a curse so dark it drove the villagers to madness before they finally fled. I never really believed them, until one evening when curiosity got the better of me. It was nearly dusk when I arrived, my car skidding to a halt on the overgrown road leading into the village. As I stepped out, the air felt heavy, dense with an almost physical sense of desolation. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no insects, just a thick, oppressive quiet that settled on my shoulders like a weight. The whole place was frozen in time, its last breaths abandoned to rot. As I wandered through the empty streets, I could almost feel eyes watching me. Shadows shifted at the edge of my vision, and once, I could have sworn I heard the faintest sound of children's laughter, light and playful, as though the village was mocking my intrusion. But when I turned, there was only emptiness. The village was long dead, yet its spirit lingered, lurking in every shadowed corner. Ahead, a figure caught my eye, a pale silhouette in the dim light. A woman in a white dress, drifting between two houses like a ghostly breeze. I blinked, and she was gone, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the deeper I went, the thicker the sense of wrongness became, like the entire village was pulling me in, drawing me deeper with invisible fingers. Then I found the church, or rather, it found me, its presence looming like a blackened wound on the village's skeleton. Inside, symbols were carved into the walls, strange, twisting marks that seemed to writhe as the last slivers of daylight faded. The air was stifling, thick with the scent of decay and mildew. A chill crawled down my spine as I realized the carvings weren't random, they formed a pattern, like a dark map leading me into deeper secrets. I shouldn't have stayed, I knew that, but something had me, an unseen force that kept me rooted to the spot. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere within, slow and deliberate, pacing as if waiting for me to follow. Every nerve screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to obey. Somewhere in the darkness, a low, guttural whisper broke the silence. "Welcome back." Part 2. The Unseen Eyes. The whisper clawed at my insides, and I stumbled back, heart pounding like a trapped animal. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the pews and the walls covered in those sinister carvings. I could feel it now, something was watching, and not just from a single point. It was as if eyes had sprouted from the very walls, the floor, the darkness itself. The church seemed alive, pulsating with a presence that fed on my fear. I forced myself to take a shaky breath, steadying my hands just enough to keep my flashlight trained on the aisle. I told myself it was the wind, just the shifting of old wood and stone, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was not alone. Then came the footsteps. They shuffled and scraped, echoing from the far end of the church, where the altar stood draped in rotting cloth. Slowly, something materialized from the shadows. It was a figure, barely more than a silhouette, yet disturbingly solid. I couldn't make out any details, but its shape was unmistakably human, or close enough to pass for one. "Who's there?" My voice came out as a whisper, but it was all I could manage. The figure halted, tilting its head, as if studying me. A sickening stillness filled the air, so thick I could barely breathe. And then, a sound, a horrible, dragging noise that echoed off the walls, a rope scraping against wood. I strained my eyes, and just behind the figure, barely visible in the dim light, was a chair hanging from the rafters by a length of frayed rope. The figure raised one hand, pale and almost skeletal, pointing behind me. I felt an icy wave of dread roll over me, and against every instinct, I turned. At first, I saw nothing but the open doorway leading out of the church. But then, just beyond it, standing in the shadows, was the woman in white. She was clearer now, her eyes hollow, a void that seemed to swallow what little light there was. Her mouth opened as if to scream, yet no sound emerged. Just that same, haunting laughter, as if it echoed from the depths of hell itself. I wanted to run, but my feet remained rooted, the fear anchoring me in place. And then, in a horrific instant, she vanished, leaving only the echo of her laughter ringing in my ears. I felt it before I saw it. The figure was closer now, standing mere feet away, reaching out toward me with claw-like fingers. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a pew, the air thickening with a rotten stench as the figure's shadow stretched over me. I bolted, tearing out of the church and back into the night. But as I reached the village square, the laughter came again, closer this time, reverberating from every direction. I turned wildly, searching for the source, only to see a new horror. From the shadows of each abandoned house, figures were emerging. Men, women, children, all in various states of decay, as if they'd risen from the very ground beneath their feet. They lined the square, hollow eyes fixed on me, mouths twisted in silent agony. Then, in unison, they raised their hands and pointed toward the church. Part 3. The house that called me. The villagers' ghastly faces stayed frozen in my mind as I staggered through the village, my breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. Everywhere I looked, the dead eyes seemed to follow, watching with a patient, silent malice. Their fingers still pointed to the church, but something told me they weren't asking me to return, they were warning me away. I kept running, desperate to escape the suffocating presence of those hollow faces. But the village felt endless, as if each twisted street was designed to lead me deeper instead of back to safety. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled upon a house. It was larger than the others, set apart as if it had once belonged to someone important. Its windows were shattered, the paint peeling in long, sorrowful strips. But unlike the rest of the village, this house seemed to call to me, pulling me forward with an invisible tether. As I approached, the front door creaked open on its own, as though the house was inviting me in. Against every instinct, I crossed the threshold, the door closing softly behind me. The silence inside was even more oppressive than outside, thick and cloying, like something waiting just beyond the edge of sight. A damp, moldy smell filled the air, mingling with something sharper, almost metallic. I could feel a strange warmth in the air, like an invisible hand pressing against my chest. The house was trying to tell me something, its walls alive with a story long forgotten. Shadows seemed to move along the corners of the room, flitting in and out of sight as though they were watching, waiting. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I made my way deeper into the house. In the dim light, I noticed faded photographs lining the walls, their images obscured by grime and time. I wiped away the dust from one of the frames, only to gasp as I recognized the woman in white, the same haunting figure I had seen in the village. In each photo, her face was turned away from the camera, her posture stiff, her hands clutched tightly at her sides. The last picture showed her standing in front of the very house I was in, her eyes visible for the first time. They were hollow, empty, and yet filled with a deep, agonizing sorrow that seemed to reach through the glass and pierce my soul. A faint noise echoed from somewhere above, a steady, rhythmic creaking, like something swaying back and forth. I froze, my gaze drawn upward to the dark stairwell that disappeared into the shadows. It was the same sound I'd heard in the church, that horrible scraping, dragging noise. My feet moved before I could stop them, drawn by the sound, each step taking me closer to whatever waited above. At the top of the stairs, I found a door, slightly ajar, the creaking sound louder than ever. I reached out, pushing it open with a trembling hand. Inside, the room was empty except for a single chair, hanging by a length of rope from the ceiling. It swayed gently, as if recently disturbed, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. And then, I saw a small object lying beneath the chair, glinting faintly in the gloom. I stepped forward, compelled to see it up close. It was a locket, old and tarnished, with initials engraved on its surface. My fingers tingled as I picked it up, the metal cold and unyielding. As I held it in my hand, an overwhelming sadness filled me, a despair so profound it felt as if it were tearing me apart. A whisper drifted through the air, soft and broken. "Help me." I spun around, but the room was empty. The voice echoed again, more insistent this time, pleading. "Help me, find him." Suddenly, everything made sense. The woman in white wasn't just a ghost, she was a prisoner, bound to this cursed place, searching for something or someone she'd lost. And whatever had claimed her was still here, still waiting, feeding off the lives of anyone foolish enough to enter. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Part 4. The haunting truth. I threw myself at the door, pounding and clawing, but it wouldn't budge. The room closed in around me, suffocating and dark, the creaking of the chair amplifying into a sickening, rhythmic beat. Shadows twisted on the walls, forming shapes that danced and writhed like phantoms caught in a fevered trance. And then I felt a presence behind me, cold, heavy, and watching. Slowly, I turned. The woman in white stood in the center of the room, her hollow eyes fixed on me, empty sockets that seemed to bleed darkness. The locket grew ice cold in my hand, and as I looked down at it, her face twisted in recognition, a semblance of life flickering across her spectral features. She took a step forward, her movements jerky, as if fighting against invisible chains. Her mouth opened, and this time, words slipped out, twisted and broken. "Please, return it." I glanced down at the locket, the initials glinting faintly in the darkness. The air seemed to throb with a desperate energy, urging me to understand. But even as I clutched it, a sickening realization began to take root. The initials didn't match hers. Somehow, I understood. This locket belonged to someone else, someone she had been searching for, drawn to this place in her endless sorrow. And the village, this cursed, empty village, was the prison that bound her and all those like her, holding them in a perpetual nightmare, feeding off their anguish. But even as I pieced it together, I felt something else stir in the room, a shift, like a shadow gaining substance. The air grew thick, choking, as a deeper, darker presence seeped from the walls, the floor, the very foundation of the house. It was the true master of this cursed village, the force that held her, and now it had set its sights on me. The woman in white's face contorted, and a sudden flash of fear crossed her empty eyes. Her mouth moved, forming silent words, but I couldn't hear her over the deafening silence that filled the room. Her hands reached toward me, her fingers skeletal and trembling. Then, out of the silence, came a voice, not hers, but something darker, twisted and mocking. "You are just like him," it whispered, echoing through the room like a hissed curse. "You think you can escape, but they all return, they all come back." The walls began to close in, shifting, almost breathing, as if the house itself was alive, tightening its hold. My mind screamed for escape, but my body felt paralyzed, pinned in place by that unseen force. I clutched the locket, the only tether to reality in the surreal nightmare unfolding around me. With every ounce of willpower I had, I forced myself to focus on the woman in white. Her gaze locked onto mine, and in her eyes, I saw a flicker of defiance, a resilience that had not yet been fully snuffed out by the curse binding her. I held up the locket, offering it to her, hoping she'd understand. The air seemed to shudder, a momentary break in the suffocating darkness. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they closed around the locket. The moment she touched it, the room seemed to ripple, as if the entire house recoiled. Her form solidified, her face softening as a tear slipped down her hollow cheek. But the darkness wasn't finished. The walls seemed to twist, the floor buckling as a growl emanated from the very foundation of the house, a low, rumbling sound that reverberated in my bones. I felt a force seize me, dragging me backward toward the far wall, pinning me in place. The woman's face twisted, and she screamed a sound of pure, unbridled agony. The locket glowed faintly in her hand, pulsing with a strange, golden light that seemed to push back against the darkness, forming a protective barrier around her. For the first time, she looked peaceful, whole, as though the curse binding her was finally beginning to release its grip. But the dark presence wasn't finished. It surged, a shadowy mass that filled the room, tendrils of blackness stretching toward me, winding around my arms, my legs, squeezing with a cold, suffocating weight. I struggled, feeling my strength slip away as the room spun in a blur of shadows and light. Just when I thought I'd be pulled under, I heard her voice, faint but clear, "Run, before it takes you too." In a final burst of desperation, I wrenched myself free, stumbling backward, toward the door that now hung open. I didn't look back. The shadows writhed and screamed behind me as I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the house as the walls twisted and groaned, the entire structure seeming to convulse in rage. Outside, the village was alive with shadows, the hollow-eyed villagers staring from every corner. But this time, they weren't looking at me, they were watching the house, their expressions mournful, almost relieved, as if they too were finally free. But as I stumbled toward the edge of the village, I knew this wasn't over. Part 5. The final revelation. The village faded behind me, but I could still feel its grip. Every step away felt harder, like I was pushing against a tide of invisible hands pulling me back. The shadows seemed to follow, hovering at the edges of my vision, waiting, watching. My car was only yards away, its familiar shape almost a beacon in the dark, and I practically threw myself against the door, yanking it open and diving inside. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking as the engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the night, casting an eerie glow over the abandoned houses. For a moment, I thought I saw the woman in white standing at us beyond the beams, her eyes no longer hollow but filled with something almost like peace. She nodded once, a solemn farewell, but as I hit the gas, speeding down the crumbling road away from the village, I noticed something else, something lying on the passenger seat. The locket. It was impossible. I had given it to her. I'd seen it in her hands, glowing as it freed her from the darkness. But here it was, gleaming faintly in the dim interior light, as if it had never left. My pulse raced as I picked it up, feeling that same cold metal against my palm. The initials were still there, clear and crisp, taunting me with their mystery. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young man, his face obscured, standing beside a woman in that same white dress. And scrawled on the opposite side, barely legible, were words that chilled me to my core. They all return, for him. The locket slipped from my hands, clattering onto the floor, but my mind was reeling. He, the figure in the church, the dark presence that haunted the village, wasn't just some ghost or cursed entity. He was the reason the village had become a wasteland, the reason she was trapped, the reason those hollow-eyed villagers pointed me toward the church. They hadn't been warning me away, they were leading me toward him, toward the source of the curse, hoping someone would finally break it. But, as the realization dawned on me, so did another, darker thought. The curse didn't end just because I'd left. It didn't vanish simply because I'd walked away. It had followed me. It was here, now, alive and pulsing with dark intent, waiting. My car shuddered, the engine sputtering as if something was gripping it, squeezing the life out of it. I looked into the rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. The woman in white was there, her hollow eyes staring back at me, and behind her, a shadow stretched, darker than night, taking the shape of the man from the photograph. His face was indistinct, blurred as if it were hidden behind a veil of darkness, but I could feel his gaze piercing me, cold and unforgiving. Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered, casting the road in erratic bursts of light and darkness. The road stretched out before me like an endless corridor, twisting, looping back on itself, the village's outline looming at the edges of my vision no matter how far I drove. Desperation clawed at me. I pressed down harder on the accelerator, but it was no use. The road curved and twisted, and somehow, impossibly, I was driving back into the heart of the village. The car came to a screeching halt in front of the church, as if some invisible force had seized control. The doors unlocked with a loud click, and though I tried to hold them shut, they flew open, as if welcoming me back. I had returned, just as he had warned. I stepped out, feeling a numbness take hold, an overwhelming sense of inevitability settling over me. The church doors loomed ahead, wide open, and I could see the faint outline of the hanging chair, swinging back and forth in the shadows. As I approached, the villagers emerged from the darkness, their eyes empty, lifeless, their hands raised as they pointed toward the church once more. But this time, they weren't warning me. They were guiding me toward the final act, urging me to finish what had been started. The woman in white appeared beside me, her eyes pleading, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, help me end this." And I knew what she meant. This wasn't just a curse, it was a cycle, a prison built on the sorrow and despair of the village's inhabitants, binding them all to this wretched place, forced to relive their torment over and over. But there was one way to break it. I took a step toward the church, my heart pounding, the villagers closing in around me, their shadows merging with mine. Inside, the figure was waiting, his dark form flickering in and out of sight, the rope swaying gently above him. The chair beckoned, a final invitation. With a deep, steadying breath, I stepped inside, the weight of the curse pressing down on me, filling me with a strange, resigned calm. I could feel the villagers' eyes upon me, their souls woven into the walls, the floor, the air itself. As I approached the figure, the locket grew cold in my hand once more, and I held it up, the initials catching the faint light. His face shifted, dark eyes narrowing, a faint smile twisting on his lips as he reached out, his hand cold as death. But I didn't flinch. I held the locket out to him, offering it, as if returning something that had been taken long ago. His eyes flickered with recognition, and for a brief moment, the darkness in his gaze faded, replaced by a hollow sadness. The rope tightened, the chair swayed, and in one final, violent shudder, the figure dissipated, his shadow scattering into the air like smoke. The village fell silent, the weight lifting as if an ancient curse had finally been broken. The woman in white stood beside me, her form beginning to fade, her eyes filled with gratitude as she whispered her final words. "Thank you for setting us free." Then, she was gone, the villagers disappearing with her, leaving only the empty village, the broken church, and me. As I walked back to my car, I realized the road was clear, the path winding back to the world I had left behind. But the memory of the village would haunt me forever, a dark reminder of the shadows we leave behind, and the price of curiosity. And in my hand, I still held the locket, its metal now warm, the initials faint, as though they too were beginning to fade.